Hello, reading room. I'm starting a little bit earlier than I had announced on the whatever, but that's because I forgot to do the Reader's Digest, and I'm not gonna forget that because that's kind of a New Year's resolution, but not a vow, but kind of a New Year's resolution, and I like it for sure. So I thought about plugging in here early and then doing Reader's Digest, but I would have to have changed all of this that was up there. And if I spent all that time, it was time for a reading room. Organization. It's a burden. Addressing her, I wrote, quote, "You are different. There was something scary in this image of young, sexual, sensual, black beauty betrayed. That daughter who did not want to be confined by blackness, that tragic mulatto who did not want to be negated. Just let me escape this image forever," she could have said. "I will always remember that image. I remembered how we cried for her, for our unrealized desiring selves. She was tragic because there was no place in the cinema for her, no loving pictures. She too was absent image. It was better then that we were absent, for when we were there, it was humiliating, strange, sad. We cried all night for you, for the cinema that had no place for you. And like you, we stopped thinking it would one day be different." When I returned to films as a young woman, after a long period of silence, I had developed an oppositional gaze. Not only would I not be hurt by the absence of black female presence or the insertion of violating representation, I interrogated the work, cultivated a way to look past race and gender for aspects of content, form, language. Foreign films and U.S. independent cinema were the primary locations of my filmic looking relations, even though I also watched Hollywood films. From Jump, black female spectators have gone to films with awareness of the way in which race and racism determined the visual construction of gender. Whether it was Birth of a Nation or Shirley Temple shows, we knew that white womanhood was the racialized sexual difference occupying the place of stardom in mainstream narrative film. We assumed white women knew it too. Reading Laura Mulvey's provocative essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, from a standpoint that acknowledges race, one sees clearly why black women spectators, not duped by mainstream cinema, would develop an oppositional gaze, placing ourselves outside that pleasure in looking, Mulvey argues, was determined by a split between active male and passive female. Black female spectators actively chose not to identify with the film's imaginary subject because such identification was disenabling. Looking at films with an oppositional gaze, black women were able to critically assess the cinema's construction of white womanhood as object of phallocentric gaze and choose not to identify with either the victim or the perpetrator. Black female spectators who refused to identify with white womanhood, who would not take on the phallocentric gaze of desire and possession, created a critical space where the binary opposition Mulvey posits of woman as image, man as bearer of the look, was continually deconstructed. As critical spectators, black women looked from a location that disrupted one akin to that described by Annette in Power of the Image. The acts of and here's the quote, "The acts of analysis, of deconstruction, and of reading against the grain offer an additional pleasure, the pleasure of resistance, of saying no. not to unsophisticated enjoyment by ourselves and others of culturally dominant images, but to the structures of power which ask us to consume them uncritically and in highly circumscribed ways. Mainstream feminist film criticism in no way acknowledges black female spectatorship. It does not even consider the possibility that women can construct an oppositional gaze via an understanding and awareness of the politics of race and racism. Feminist film theory, rooted in an ahistorical psychoanalytic framework with that privileges sexual differences, actively suppresses recognition of race, reenacting and mirroring the erasure of black womanhood that occurs in film, silencing any discussion of racial difference, of racialized sexual difference. Despite feminist critical interventions aimed at deconstructing the category woman, which highlights the significance of race, many feminist film critics continue to structure their discourse as though it speaks about women, when in actuality it speaks only about white women. It seems ironic. And no, film does not speak only about white women, and those black women roles speak only about black women. Unless you say Harlem Nights did not. I don't know. It seems ironic that the cover of the recent anthology, Feminism and Film Theory, edited by Constance Penley, has a graphic that is a reproduction of the photo of white actresses Rosalind Russell and Dorothea Arzner on the 1936 set of the film Craig's Wife, yet there is no acknowledgement in any essay in this collection that the woman subject under discussion is always white, even though there are photos of black women from films reproduced in the text. There is no acknowledgement of racial difference. It would be too simplistic to interpret this failure as insight solely as a gesture of racism. Importantly, it also speaks to the problem of structuring feminist film theory around a totalizing narrative of women as an object whose image functions solely to reaffirm and reinscribe patriarchy. Mary Ann Doane addresses this issue in the essay Remembering Women, Psychical and Historical Construction in Film Theory. Here's the quote. The attachment of the figure of the degeneralizable woman as the product of the apparatus indicates why, for many feminist film theory seems to have reached an impasse, a certain blockage in its theorization, and focusing upon the task of delineating in great detail the attributes of woman as effect of the apparatus. Feminist film theory participates in the abstraction of women. Now, I agree totally. You know, we watched in a film class, because I only took one for humanities, Blue Velvet. And using that in order to critique feminism in whatever way is necessary as it relates to that film. Well, you know, don't throw in a bunch of sparks and gasoline, you know, and then fart. All right, sometimes I laugh too hard at my own jokes. But a fart joke, it just goes to show you they're always funny. The concept woman effaces the difference between women in specific socio-historical context, between women defined precisely as historical subjects, rather than as a psychic subject or non-subject. Though Doan does not focus on race, her comments speak directly to the problem of its erasure. For it is only as one imagines woman in the abstract, when woman becomes fiction or fantasy, can race not be seen as significant. Are we really to imagine that feminist theorists writing only about images of white women who subsume this specific historical subject under the totalizing category woman, do not see the whiteness of the image? It may very well be that they engage in a process of denial that eliminates the necessity of revisioning conventional ways of thinking about psychoanalysis as a paradigm of analysis, and the need to rethink a body of feminist film theory that is firmly rooted in a denial of the reality that sexuality may not be the primary and or exclusive signifier of difference. Doan's essay appears to a very recent anthology. In a very recent anthology, Psychoanalysis and Cinema, edited by E. Annan Kaplan, where once again none of the theory presented acknowledges or discusses racial difference, with the exception of one essay, Not Speaking with Language, Speaking with No Language, which problematizes notions of Orientalism in its examination of Leslie Thornton's film Adinata. Yet in most of the essays the theories espoused are rendered problematic if one includes race as a category of analysis. Okay, so oh, here it is. Here it is. Ann Kaplan. That name sounds familiar. I did have a Professor Kaplan who was part of the social psychology staff. He was eccentric, and that's being really nice. All the out there and left people, all the out there and left field people were, of course, eccentric. That philosophy teacher of mine. I'll never remember her name. Never! I might. Why does all of a sudden Alexandria or Alexandra or something like that come to mind? So I had to put it out of my mind if I had a daughter. Yikes. Anyway, but it was her last name, whatever. She let us call her by her first name. That, yes, that's the only thing that she had. Not speaking with language, speaking with no language, which problematizes notions of Orientalism. That, I'm almost sure, was the word that she used. And not that I haven't used it, but it's really difficult to say that I've got this feminism thing. Well, I don't know. You know. Constructing feminist film theory along these lines enables the production of a discursive practice that need never theorize any aspect of Black female representation or spectatorship, yet the existence of Black women within white supremacist culture problematizes and makes complex the overall issue of female identity, representation, and spectatorship. If, as Friedberg suggests, identification is a process which commands a subject to be displaced by an other, it is a procedure which breaches the separation between self and other, and in this way replicates the very structure of patriarchy. If identification, quote, demands sameness, necessitates similarity, disallows difference, must we then summarize that many feminist film critics who are, quote, over-identified with the mainstream cinematic apparatus produce theories that replicate its totalizing agenda? Why is it that feminist film criticism, which has the most claimed terrain of women's identity, representation, and subjectivity as its field of analysis, remain aggressively silent on the subject of blackness and specifically representations of black womanhood? Just as mainstream cinema has historically forced aware black female spectators not to look, much feminist film criticism disallows the possibility of a theoretical dialogue that might include black women's voices. It is difficult to talk when you feel no one is listening, when you feel as though a special jargon or narrative has been created that only the chosen can understand. No wonder then that black women have, for the most part, confined our critical commentary on film to conversations, and it must be reiterated that this gesture is a strategy that protects us from the violence perpetuated and advocated by discourses of mass media. A new focus on issues of race and representation in the field of film theory could critically intervene on the historical repression reproduced in some arenas of contemporary critical practice, making a discursive space for discussion of black female spectatorship possible. When I ask a black, also I'll give you another clue about this writing. There is obviously a philosophical jargon that you must enter, as she's sort of talking about, when you enter this book, right? There's just jargon all over the place. But what I've noticed is that the jargon is a hard hit of this is what this chapter is about, and I can't do it in one paragraph because it's a philosophical argument, and she usually lays that out, and then she starts with the evidence and the detail, building that argument she presents in a very philosophical way, and it makes sense. I mean, each argument, or you're able to digest what she said in the beginning. You're just like, I don't know if I got it, but I do get this part, and I got this part, and I got this part. Those are when she starts laying out the details. All right? So sometimes going into the ozone layer is not unheard of. Seriously, I stopped in the middle of that giant paragraph? No, I read that and said that there we go. When I asked a black woman in her 20s, an obsessive moviegoer, why she thought we had not written about black female spectatorship, she commented, I don't know what you're talking about even still. We're afraid to talk about ourselves as spectators because we have been so abused by the gaze. An aspect of that abuse was the imposition of the assumption that black female looking relations were not important enough to theorize. Film theory as a critical turf in the United States has been and continues to be influenced by and reflective of white racial domination. Since feminist film criticism was initially rooted in a woman's liberation movement informed by racist practices, it did not open up the discursive terrain and make it more inclusive. Recently, even those white film theorists who include an analysis of race show no interest in black female spectatorship. In her introduction to the collection of essays, Visual and Other Pleasures, Laura Mulvey describes her initial romantic absorption in Hollywood cinema, stating, although this great, previously unquestioned and unanalyzed love was put in crisis by the impact of feminism on my thought in the early 1970s, it also had an enormous influence on the development of my critical work and ideas and the debate within film culture, with which I became preoccupied over the next 15 years or so. Watched through eyes that were affected by the changing climate of consciousness, the movies lost their magic. Well, that's something. Watched through eyes that were affected by the changing climate of consciousness. As you became so, it's like we couldn't get away with that now, which is one of the things we talked about with the comments on prejudice. But you could get away with it now if it were done in the same vein as Reader's Digest is done, right? That is anonymous, completely anonymous, with the notion that I'll publish your city from the stamp that's on your envelope, meaning if you're in Chicago but you live in Los Angeles, you could mail it there, get the stamp, and I would never know. But you would know you'd be chronicled as Chicago. I mean, that's the way it is, and everyone would know. Stamped, that's where we got the information, and everyone has the availability of not being from there. So that would be the luxury of something like, which is what we talked about in our Reader's Digest edition part of, or portion of, the Bookless classroom. The last few, I think we started it last Thursday, maybe. Maybe we started last Thursday. So, watched through eyes that were affected by the changing climate of consciousness, the movies lost their magic. So this idea that it's not appropriate to do that anymore, which would give rise to a woke community, right? It would give rise to a, what's the word I'm looking for? Hyper alert mechanism by which white people need to function and note what's going on in the background. No different than a hyper alertness to chocolate boobs in a bakery. What do you want me to be hyper alert about? What do you want me to be hyper alert about? What the suggestion is because of those chocolate tits? We can say it now. Is that what you want me to be hyper alert about? What the political race statement it makes? Or would you rather have me be less hyper alert and more about, and then I couldn't buy them. Now I can't buy them. I was going to buy them. Now you've taken the joy out of buying those chocolate boobs. That is no different than what she's saying right here. Watch through eyes that were affected by the changing climate of consciousness, the movies lost their magic. Now, magic is one thing. Distortion is another, and everyone needs to be checked on their distortion. I don't think it was distorted for me to go buy chocolate boobs and then or had any racial connotation. Right? I mean, it leads to putting what on your body for a fun time? Something nutritious that everybody can go for? Nuts and berries? Watching movies from a feminist perspective, Mulvey arrived at that location of disaffection that is the starting point for many black women approaching cinema within the lived harsh reality of racism. Yet her account of being a part of a film culture whose roots rest on a founding relationship of adoration and love indicates how difficult it would have been to enter the world from jump as a critical spectator whose gaze had been formed in opposition. They keep putting jump in quotes, and I don't understand. All right, I get it's got something like reaction jump and you know, but I don't get all the terminology. Like, where's the definition part of this book? Not there. Like, what do you really mean? Why is jump in quotation marks? See, that's what I mean. What do you really mean? Given the concept of class exploitation and racist and sexist domination, it has only been through resistance, struggle, reading, and looking against the grain that black women have been able to value our process of looking enough to publicly name it. Centrally, those black female spectators who attest to the oppositionality of their gaze deconstruct theories of female spectatorship that have relied heavily on the assumption that, as Doan suggests in her essay, Women's Stake Filming the Female Body, quote, women can only mimic man's relation to language, that is, assume a position defined by the penis phallus as the supreme arbiter of lack, identifying with neither the phallocentric gaze nor the construction of white womanhood as lack. Critical black female spectators construct a theory of looking relations where cinematic visual delight is the pleasure of interrogation. Every black woman spectator I talked to, with rare exception, spoke of being on guard at the movies, talking about the way being a critical spectator of Hollywood films influenced her. Black woman filmmaker Julie Dash exclaims, quote, I make films because I was such a spectator, looking at Hollywood cinema from a distance, from that critical, politicized standpoint that did not want to be seduced by narratives reproducing her negation. Dash watched mainstream movies over and over again for the pleasure of deconstructing them. And of course, there is that added delight if one happens in the process of interrogation to come across a narrative that invites the black female spectator to engage the text with no threat of violation. Interesting. I'm starting to absorb it. Yeah. At first, the black female spectator had nobody paid attention to her. The audience, who was in the audience judging that? I don't know. I love it. I like it. Don't get me wrong. I really like it a lot. It makes you, doesn't it stretch your mind? I think it does. Stretches my mind with no threat of violation. Right there. Right there. I'm the spectator reading the words, being critical. So that's an example too. Significantly, I began to write film criticism in response to the first Spike Lee movie, She's Gotta Have It, contesting Lee's replication of mainstream patriarchal cinematic practices that explicitly represent woman, in this instance, black woman, as the object of a phallocentric gaze. Lee's investment in patriarchal filmic practices that mirror dominant patterns makes him the perfect black candidate for entrance to the Hollywood canon. His work mimics the cinematic construction of white womanhood as object, replacing her body as text on which to write male desire with the black female body. That's what it says. It is transference without transformation, entering the discourse of film criticism from the politicized location of resistance, of not wanting. As a working class black woman I interviewed stated, quote, to see black women in the position white women have occupied in film forever, I began to think critically about black female spectatorship. Still having a difficult time. I am. For years, a difficult time getting that lighting right. A little better. For years, I went to independent and or foreign films where I was the only black female present in the theater. I often imagined that in every theater in the United States, there was another black woman watching the same film, wondering why she was the only visible black female spectator. I remember trying to share with one of my 5 sisters the cinema I liked so much. She was enraged that I brought her to a theater where she would have to read subtitles. To her, it was a violation of Hollywood notions of spectatorship, of coming to the movies to be entertained. When I interviewed her to ask what had changed her mind over the years, led her to embrace this cinema, she connected it to coming to critical consciousness, saying, I learned that there was more to looking than I had been exposed to in ordinary Hollywood movies. I shared that though most of the films I loved were all white, I could engage them because they did not have in their deep structure a subtext reproducing the narrative of white supremacy. Her response was to say that these films demystified whiteness, since the lives they depicted seemed less rooted in fantasies of escape. They were, she suggested, more like what we knew life to be, the deeper side of life as well. Always more seduced and enhanced and enchanted with Hollywood cinema than me, she stressed that unaware black female spectators must break out, no longer be imprisoned by images that enact a drama of our negation. Though she still sees Hollywood films because they are a major influence in the culture, she no longer feels duped or victimized. Talking with black female spectators, looking at written discussions either in fiction or academic essays about black women, I noted the connection made between the realm of representation in mass media and the capacity of black women to construct ourselves as subjects in daily life. The extent to which black women feel devalued, objectified, dehumanized in the society determines the scope and texture of their looking relations. Like even the relations of looking at that chocolate-covered cupcakes, at those chocolate-covered cupcakes, by practices that oppose, although they were bigger than cupcakes, let's just put it there. They were angel food cake size, if you know what I mean. Those black women whose identities were constructed, and isn't that funny, in resistance by practices that oppose the dominant order, were most inclined to develop an oppositional gaze. And I'm not lying about that, I think it was. Now that there is a growing interest in films produced by black women, and those films have become become more accessible to viewers, it is possible to talk about Black female spectatorship in relation to that work. So far, most discussions of Black spectatorship that I have come across focus on men. In Black spectatorship, problems of identification and resistance, Manthea Diawara suggests that the components of difference among elements of sex, gender, and sexuality give rise to different readings of the same material, adding that those conditions produce a resisting spectator. He focuses his critical discussion on Black masculinity. The recent publication of the anthology of the female gaze, women as viewers of popular culture, excited me, especially as it included an essay, Black Looks, by Jackie Roach and Patel Felix, that attempts to address Black female spectatorship. The essay posed provocative questions that were not answered. Is there a Black female gaze? How do Black women relate to the gender politics of representation? Concluding, the authors assert that Black females have, quote, our own reality, our own history, our own gaze, one which sees the world rather differently from anyone else. That's what it says there. Yet they do not describe this experience of seeing rather differently. The absence of definition and explanation suggests they are assuming an essentialist stance wherein it is presumed that Black women, as victims of race and gender oppression, have an inherently different field of vision. Many Black women do not see differently precisely because their perception of reality are so profoundly colonized, shaped by dominant ways of knowing. As Trin T. Minha points out, in Outside In, Inside Out, subjectivity does not merely consist of talking about oneself, be this talking indulgent or critical. No. Once again, you are erasing the Black viewer, right? The Black female spectator. Right? By saying, is it necessary? Many Black women do not see differently precisely because their perceptions of reality are so profoundly colonized. Seriously? You still don't think they see differently? After the and that was in quotes, right? So that was from not this author, but Minha. Right? And if you come from something where you as a Black spectator are not colonized, you would see Black spectatorship as being very colonized. Likely, or could. It's a possibility, certainly. Critical Black female spectatorship emerges as a site of resistance only when individual Black women actively resist the imposition of dominant ways of knowing and looking. While every Black woman I talked to was aware of racism, that awareness did not automatically correspond with politicization, the development of an oppositional gaze. When it did, individual Black women consciously named the process. Manthea Diawara's resisting spectatorship is a term that does not adequately describe the terrain of Black female spectatorship. We do more than resist. We create alternative texts that are not solely reactions. There you go. There you go. So it is different. So Black spectatorship is different right there. We create alternative texts that are not solely reactions. As critical spectators, Black women participate in a broad range of looking relations, contest, resist, revision, interrogate, and invent on multiple levels, as I think all women do. But it is different because that schema that they're working with is different than other women of color, of less color, of more color, whatever. Certainly, when I watch the work of black women filmmakers, Camille Billups, Kathleen Collins, Julie Dash, Ayoka Senzira, Zainabu Davis, I do not need to resist the images, even as I still choose to watch their work with a critical eye. Black female critical thinkers concerned with creating space for the construction of radical black female subjectivity and the way cultural production informs this possibility fully acknowledge the importance of mass media, film in particular, as a powerful site for critical intervention. Certainly, Julie Dash's film Illusions identifies the terrain of Hollywood cinema as a space of knowledge production that has enormous power, yet she also creates a filmic narrative wherein the black female protagonist subversively claims that space. Inventing the real life power structure, she offers the black female spectator representations that challenge stereotypical notions that place us outside the realm of filmic discursive practices. Oh, there was no stop there, sorry. Within the film, she uses the strategy of Hollywood suspense films to undermine those cinematic practices that deny black women a place in this structure, problematizing the question of racial identity by depicting passing suddenly it is the white male's capacity to gaze, define, and know that is called into question. How interesting is that? Now that she is beginning to analyze as a spectator what is going on, she is reclaiming the white man as a male spectator. That's what this is saying. Don't kill the messenger. Oh, you are? Because it was a reinterpretation? Problematizing the question of racial identity by depicting passing. Suddenly, it is the white man's capacity to gaze, define, and know that is called into question. Now, problematizing the question of racial identity by depicting passing. I don't understand that word, passing, right there. When Marianne Doan describes in Woman's Stake, filming the female body, the way in which feminist filmmaking practice can elaborate, quote, a special syntax for a different articulation of female body, she names a critical process that undoes the structure of the classical narrative through an insistence upon its repressions. An eloquent description, this precisely names Dash's strategy and illusions, even though the film is not unproblematic and works within certain conventions that are not successfully challenged. For example, the film does not indicate whether the character Mignon will make Hollywood films that subvert and transform the genre, or whether she will simply assimilate and perpetuate the norm. Still, subversively, Illusions problematizes the issue of race and spectatorship. White people in the film are unable to see that race informs their looking relations. Though she is passing to gain access to the machinery of cultural production represented by film, Mignon continually asserts her ties to black community. The bond between her and the young black woman singer Esther Jeter is affirmed by caring gestures of affirmation, often expressed by eye-to-eye contact, the direct, unmediated gaze of recognition. Ironically, it is the desiring, objectifying, sexualized white male gaze that threatens to penetrate her, quote, secrets and disrupt her process. Metaphorically, Dash suggests the power of black women to make films will be threatened and undermined by that white male gaze that seeks to reinscribe the black female body in a narrative of voyeuristic pleasure where the only relevant opposition is male-female and the only location for the female is as a victim. These tensions are not resolved by the narrative. It is not at all evident that Mignon will triumph over the white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist, dominating gaze. Throughout Illusions, Mignon's power is affirmed by her contact with the younger black woman whom she nurtures and protects. It is this process of mirrored recognition that enables both black women to define their reality apart from the reality imposed upon them by structures of domination. The shared gaze of the two women reinforces their solidarity. As the youngest subject, Esther represents a potential audience for films that Mignon might produce, films wherein black females will be the narrative focus. Julie Dash's recent feature-length film, Daughters of the Dust, dares to place black females at the center of its narrative. This focus causes critics, especially white males, to critique the film negatively or to express many reservations. Clearly, the impact of racism and sexism so overdetermines spectatorship, not only what we look at, but who we identify with, that viewers who are not black females find it hard to empathize with the central characters in the movie. They are adrift without a white presence in the film. Another representation of black females nurturing one another via recognition of their common struggle for subjectivity is depicted in Sankoffa's collective work, Passion of Remembrance. In the film, two black women friends, Louise and Maggie, are from the onset of the narrative struggling with the issue of subjectivity, of their place in progressive black liberation movements that have been sexist. They challenge old norms and want to replace them with new understandings of the complexity of black identity and the need for liberation struggles that addresses that complexity. Dressing to go to a party, Louise and Maggie claim the gaze. Looking at one another, staring in mirrors, they appear completely focused on their encounter with black femaleness. How they see themselves is most important, not how they will be stared at by others. Dancing to the tune, Let's Get Loose, they display their bodies not for a voyeuristic, colonizing gaze, but for that look of recognition that affirms their subjectivity, that constitutes them as spectators. Mutually empowered, they eagerly leave that privatized domain to confront the public, disrupting conventional racist and sexist stereotypical representations of black female bodies. These scenes invite the audience to look differently. They act to critically intervene and transform conventional filmic practices, changing notions of spectatorship. Illusions, Daughters of the Dust, and A Passion of Remembrance employ a deconstructive filmic practice to undermine existing grand cinematic narratives, even as they re-theorize subjectivity in the realm of the visual, without providing realistic positive representations that emerge only as a response to the totalizing nature of existing narratives. They offer points of radical departure, opening up a space for the assertion of a critical black female spectatorship. They do not simply offer diverse representations, they imagine new transgressive possibilities for the formulation of identity. In this sense, they make explicit a critical practice that provides us with different ways to think about black female subjectivity and black female spectatorship. Cinematically, they provide new points of recognition, embodying Stuart Hall's vision of a critical practice that acknowledges that identity is constituted not outside but within representation, and invites us to see film not as a second-order mirror held up to reflect what already exists, but as that form of representation which is able to constitute us as new kinds of subjects and thereby enable us to discover who we are. It is this critical practice that enables production of feminist film theory that theorizes Black female spectatorship, looking back. Black women involve ourselves in a process whereby we see our history as counter memory, using it as a way to know the present and invent the future. I think that's where we started. Okay, so we are ending there, though. That is the end of chapter 7. We are on to chapter 8, so not nearly as long as chapter 6, that's for sure. So, Michaud's films, Michaud, Micheaux, Michaud's film, Celebrating Blackness. Chapter 8, we will go into that tomorrow on our last day here in the reading room of 3 days on, and then we'll go into our 4 days off. As you know, I am going to come back here. So I'm going to load it up. It's not going to be a long segment. It'll probably be hopefully 15 minutes, but it'll give me an idea at a time how long our regular segments are going to be for the reading, for the Bookless classroom, for our Reader's Digest segment. So I'm going to be back here. Like I said, I'm going to load it up. I'm going to decide when I'm going to get back here, which is going to be just 5 minutes after I load it up, 10 minutes after I load it up. I'm not sure. It just depends. And something like that. And we will be back here for another segment of the Bookless classroom where we are going to do our Reader's Digest segment. So stay tuned. Another classroom coming up in a shorty. Thanks so much for joining me here in the reading room where we kept it pure on Bell Hooks Black Looks. It's January 14th. It's day 298. I'm the teacher. This is the classroom. We just plug along diligently, making our minds and our bodies and our spirits healthier every moment. Thanks so much for joining me.